أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, I hope you're all well. Jazakumullah khair for joining us for another episode of Real Talk. Another episode. It has been a while since we did our last one. Our last series was just after and during the month of Dhul Hijjah Real Talk. It is absolutely fantastic to have you here with us this evening on this public holiday. Not sure if you've been mourning the Queen's death, but if that's your thing, then so be it. But I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the return of the series for a two-part mini-series on the issue of domestic violence. Now, the name of today's episode is Muslim Men and Domestic Violence, Unheard Voices, ? Where we're going to have a very, very important discussion on an issue which our community often doesn't address in the way that we will be hoping to address today, in a very frank and open sort of way, to give, to give an airtime to some perspectives that perhaps we may not hear in the context of the domestic violence discussion. Now, I do want to say right at the top of today's episode, just want to state a trigger warning for people who may have been victims of domestic violence or may have been in a context where domestic violence was something that they experienced or knew someone who might have experienced it. We are going to be talking about some matters today that may bring back some memories, that may trigger some emotions, that may cause some harm to some of our viewers. So please, if you're not ready or in a good place to be able to listen to some of those things, then do consider whether you're really in a good spot to be listening to this episode, inshallah. Of course, everything said will be discussed in the most respectful and becoming of ways, and I'm sure by the end of today's episode we'll make some fantastic ground on very, very important topics. Now, the idea behind today's episode is to examine our community's response to domestic and family violence with the experience of brothers in our community and males and the male voice as a sharp focus. It's not just necessarily a discussion about specific instances or anecdotes of what may have happened to brothers that we may not hear about, although we will touch on some of that. It's more taking a step back and looking at the nature of the discussion and the nature of the domestic violence issue more generally as well. We're talking about several important issues, such as whether the current discussion on domestic violence may alienate some brothers or men in our community. We're talking about some experiences from the ground of men who suffer from domestic violence, and maybe their voices haven't been able to be heard because there is so much going on when it comes to, and necessarily so, the voice of our sisters. So we're talking about that, plus the idea of when we respond to the issue of domestic violence, where is the role of Islam and our tradition and our fiqh and the logic and the lexicon of our deen when it comes to that particular issue, the issue of rights, obligations, and making sure that, even if we're taking when it comes to the domestic violence issue, some of the good work that is happening in the rest of society in that regard, that we're also keeping a very, very firm grounding and closeness to our deen in how we approach the solutions to this particular problem. Now, I've got with me two very esteemed members of our community, but before I introduce them, we're just going to go to a little video that has been made previously for NZF on this particular issue. It looks at the case of a particular domestic violence victim and how in this case NZF came to the help and support of that particular sister. Team, if we're ready to roll that video, can I please?
I can look back and smile now. I barely made it through a time I would never wish on anyone. It took some time, but eventually things between my ex-husband and I broke down. We had grown apart, distant, detached. He spent more and more time out of the home, often messaging me saying that he'll be out late. When he was home, we hardly spent time together, him in his world and me in mine.
Then it has real implications for others.
A giant padlock is about to snap shut on Sydney and the rest of the
When COVID-19 hit and the country went into lockdown, things got worse. Much worse. The time I had to myself during the day turned into long hours of awkwardness and silence. I could no longer stand being at home, and I could feel his increasing irritation with me. One day it all happened. He finally told me what he'd been up to, how he felt about me, and that he had secretly married a second wife. Because of lockdown, he was unable to see her. I was shocked and angry. I felt betrayed. He gave me 3 days to leave the house. He wanted me and my children out. It didn't sink in until the day we closed the door on the house we called home for many years. I did what I had to do to get through that night. I didn't know where to go or who to turn to. We slept in the car. I didn't know where to go or how to get by. I would need to figure it out myself. My children and I left to fend for ourselves. I finally reached out to a friend who had given me her time. I explained to her what had happened, where I was living, the nightmare of each day. She referred me to National Zakat Foundation straight away. She said if there was anyone who could be there for me in our community, it would be NZF. I made the call. The caseworker listened intently and provided me with the immediate support to help me get by for the time being. They organized a meeting to find out what other support we needed. By the end of the call, I felt safe, knowing that there was someone out there who could help. Thanks to NZF support, I've been able to rent a place for me and the kids to stay. We have what we need to get by. Their support has helped me get back on my feet and given me a chance to build towards the future, and most importantly, to smile again.
Thank you to the team there. And as that particular video highlights, it's relevant and important at this juncture just to note the good work that National Zakat Foundation is doing in this particular context. To those of our audience that may be joining for the first time or may not be familiar with NZF, NZF NZF Australia is the Australia-based chapter of the international NGO, Islamic NGO, National Zakat Foundation, whose purpose it is and whose mission it is to power the potential of zakah given locally in our Western context back into the local community and to the people in that community who are eligible for zakah. At the moment, NZF is doing a month-long campaign on the issue of domestic violence and specifically raising sadaqah to be able to help support many of the victims of domestic violence that it works with in our community. So if you've been online and you may very well have seen some of the activity that NZF has been doing. There's been events on the ground, there's been events online, and there's a lot of social media activism happening as well. Do find out more about NZF's work by going to nzf.org.au, and if you are able to, then please support the amazing work that it's doing in this particular space. But without further ado, let me, inshallah, introduce the two panelists that we have for today's discussion. And get right into it. So we have in the studio with us today two esteemed young mashayikh from the community. Inshallah, they go on to become forces of good long into the future. We've got Sheikh Jamal-Ud-Din El-Kiki and we've got Sheikh Mohammed. Absolutely fantastic to have you both with us. Assalamu alaikum. And I'll just say a quick bit about both. It's getting to that weird point now where, because I'm coming along in age, these are actually, in some cases, brothers younger than me, believe it or not. We grew up together in the community, so it's wonderful to bring their knowledge back for the benefit of our viewers. Sheikh Jamal, who needs very little introduction to most in our community, mashallah, studied at Medina University for many years, specializing in Sharia and fiqh. Mashallah, he's a hafiz of the Quran, he's a qari, he leads the prayer, he leads the Jumu'ah khutbah actually at the moment at one of Australia's iconic mosques, LMA. So he's one of the imams there and he's working in the religious services department over there at the moment. We've also got Sheikh Mohammed, who also is a resident imam at one of the oldest masjids in our community, that being Zetland, and he's currently the Dawah and Iftar manager at AFIC, and he studied Sharia and fiqh in Lebanon for several years and continues to study to this day. So, brothers, sheikhs, whatever I should call you, you are my, very much my sort of peers in terms of age. Very, very good to have you on this episode, and very much looking forward to today's discussion. Now, look, tonight's, just for some context, tonight's is an interesting and pretty critical discussion, as I'm sure you'll agree. We're trying to explore here the experience with or views on domestic violence from members of our community that we've probably heard a little bit less on for whatever reason. Now, DV is no longer, at a macro level, DV is no longer the unaddressed phenomenon that it was in many ways until some years ago. But we're trying to address voices today that either are missing from the conversation or may feel like they're missing from the conversation. And it's important that they have a place at the conversation because they're an important part of our community. I also want to, explicitly recognize at the start that we're dealing with a complex and controversial issue. Controversy is never far away from this topic because of its intersection with major social issues in our community when it comes to rights, obligations in marriage, gender rights, interactions, etc. And of course, in broader society, the culture wars and the gender wars that often feature very prominently in even macro level politics between the left and the right, conservatives and liberals. It all just sort of comes together here on this particular issue. So we want to try and go beyond that tonight, but not ignore the conversation and issues that already are being discussed, but instead try to really engage with some of them in a very, very respectful way, inshallah. And to start with, I want to start with a question to both of you, and I'll start with Sheikh Jamal first, is what are your experiences dealing with or addressing the issue of domestic and family violence in our community? In what capacity have you been acquainted with this issue to date?
Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So I don't have actually a very direct capacity. So basically, in terms of my role at the LMA, that's been continuing since November of last year. So it's been about 10 months so far. And one of the roles that I've been undertaking under the mentorship of more senior Mashaykh is family reconciliation, especially like reconciliation between, I guess, estranged spouses. And so yeah, in terms of it not being direct, it's more, of a focus on reconciliation as opposed to, intervention on DV itself, but sort of, in a secondary way, or, in some cases, naturally, like there are instances, there is an overlap and there is often DV involved. And and it's not necessarily from, one party against the other. I mean, for the most part, it's often just, a dysfunctional marriage where there's an action and reaction between the two parties, between the husband and wife. So in terms of my role, in terms of my experience, it's been sort of within that sort of capacity.
Do you see it raised a lot? Do you see the charge of abuse or violence or domestic violence in these sorts of contexts of marital breakdown? Do you see that as a common theme?
It's it's often the claim of the wife involved, the wife complaining about the abuse or neglect of the husband. So the thing with DV, it's like violence, but then when you look at the categories of abuse that sort of fall under that or that are placed under that, there's often types of abuse that aren't actually violent per se. It's more just a form of abuse, a form of injustice. And so sorry, what was the question?
So it is raised quite a bit. You're saying, basically.
Obviously,
it's a frequent thing.
If she's complaining, if she wants out of the marriage, or sometimes it's a husband, by the way. If either spouse want out of the marriage, then naturally, it's going to be justified on the basis of some sort of grievance, and typically it's some sort of abuse, some sort of oppression. We don't have to stick to the the terminology of that's used within domestic violence, but oppression, volume, udwan, but there's something of that of that sort. So it ends up being some sort of abuse or neglect ultimately. Otherwise, why are you complaining?
Sheikh Mohammed, what about yourself?
So first of all, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd, thanks for this opportunity, jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah, it will be beneficial for everyone who's listening. And inshallah it will also ignite further discussion and help us to actually work collectively as a community to move forward. As for me and my work, so I graduated a bit over 10 years ago now from Lebanon and came back to Australia. So 10 years in the community, spent significant time as Imam in Hornsby and then in Bankstown area and now in Zetland. One of the ways that I like to view my own role within the community is that I like to try and help people to navigate their challenges, whatever challenges they have in life. And so often people will come to the Imam. They'll come to the Imam with their issues, with their struggles, because they feel that the Imam is the one who can give them a way forward or provide them, a way out if they're in a very difficult situation. And so it's about this navigation as an Imam, I feel like there is a real need to have the interests of both parties at heart. Even the one who looks to be the real enemy, and looks to be like the real troublemaker and the transgressor, you have their interest at heart as well. And so that's kind of been my approach to all of it. I listen to the people, I hear them out. I try to offer them some advice. If it seems that they need to see a professional, like a professional counselor, psychologist, we pass them over to them. In my work, in my current work as Imam of Zetland Mosque, and my office is in the AFIC office, we do get a lot of phone calls actually, people who are struggling, struggling to navigate through life, and often it's relationships. It's based on their relationships, and like Sheikh Jamal was saying, it's like we get men and women, and their struggles are sometimes there's overlaps in the struggle, and sometimes there's differences in the struggle. Yeah.
And do you see the issue of abuse and domestic violence and stuff frequently cited as one of the reasons for grievance in those relationships?
Sometimes, like I tend not to delve too much into these struggles themselves. I hear them out. I try to offer them some advice, but if it's a complex issue where there's clear oppression involved, my role within AFIC as Dawah and Iftat manager, it's not to be a counsellor. So it's usually something that I pass on to somebody else.
Sure. Yeah. And which sort of professionals are you typically passing on to?
So we give. Of course, I know you've had the guy on the program before, Brother Mohammed Rima.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And so we do mention to him, and we see. And I think one of the things that NZF does quite well is they connect with grassroots organisations that are in the community that do good work. And I think that's an important thing for us as a community, to just see who's doing good work out there and connect with them and see where we can actually pass the need case, the different cases and the different needs.
Connect up within the communities.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'll start with Sheikh Jamal on this one. What do you think is the reality of domestic and family violence in our community? How bad is it? How bad is the situation? Is it worse than the rest of the society? Does it matter if it's better or worse than the rest of the society? Is that a question that we should be asking? And is this comparative way of looking at it more helpful or less helpful? Is it part of perhaps an external agenda that forces us to, as the violent Muslim problem, have some of us internalized that? Or is it genuinely because it's much worse in our community? Where do you think this is at?
Yeah, so in terms of how I see it and how I would approach it, I would treat it like any other social problem that's found within the Muslim community. I mean, naturally, there's all sorts of addiction problems. There's all sorts of and similar to addictions, similar to other social problems, you have the issue of domestic violence. So comparatively speaking, I don't think it's necessarily more of an issue. It's not inherent to the Muslim community more than other communities. It just happens to be in the Muslim community, and it's something that needs to be addressed and treated. And I think that's pretty much the how we're approaching this. We're not suggesting that there's something uniquely Islamic or uniquely Muslim about it. Yeah. But I would say that like our particular community, or at least large sections of this community are quite traumatized. There's the trauma of I guess our parents' generation migrating to Australia. The traumas involved in displacement, the traumas involved in coming from war-torn regions. The vicarious trauma that some of us experience. When they're like seeing the suffering overseas. So there's that layer. There's the layer of the alienation of Muslims. Especially post 9/11. There was that, and then there's just recently, the lockdown, and coming out of that, so, this has residual effects, and it affects, the way we function, the way we interact with others, especially in the domestic setting. Sure. In that way, perhaps, there's certain traumas within the Muslim community that are not perhaps consistent with other spheres and other communities.
That needs to be kept in mind when having this.
That's right. Yeah. So it's sort of that approach, and really it's not about blaming. When we're talking about this, the fact that trauma is involved. We're not saying that it's all about people being bad or Muslim men being evil. It's more about evil actions taking place, evil treatment taking place, but there's also a background to it. There's a context, and so there should be, as far as I'm concerned, a focus on healing, a focus on moving forward. In order to inshallah, resolve this issue that is among the other issues that are found within the community. Yeah.
Sheikh Mohammed, what do you think?
So I often try to use terminology that's relative to our own context and our own community. And if we consider within the scope of our topic, we're talking about situations where one of the partners is, or sometimes there's this cycle, and so there's a back and forth, where there's physical abuse or significant emotional, psychological abuse. And as Sheikh Jamal rightly noted, there's a lot of environmental and circumstantial matters that can influence this, that can cause this to spread. To try and answer your question directly, I don't think it is more prevalent in the Muslim community. It might seem that way at some point, but I think altogether it's likely to be a false attribution, and it's more likely to be, I think, a matter of socioeconomics and other factors altogether, because there's nothing inherent about Islam that makes a person more prone or susceptible to be a domestic violence abuser. So I do think it's a false attribution, and I can't quote specific statistics, but if you consider, for instance, that so community corrections, right, parole. Yeah, so they deal with people like offenders who are transitioning back into the community, or with people on community orders, and so they're divided into jurisdictions, right? And so if you want to take a look at it, if someone wants to actually do the study, like do the hard work and do the study, I strongly believe that they will not find that in areas where there's more a Muslim population that is statistically significant for domestic violence.
Yeah, compared to the rest of the population.
Compared to the rest of the population, compared to other, if you also compare socioeconomic status, and I think that's an important consideration too, because I think we might get to this later in the discussion. When we look at the messaging around domestic violence, it almost seems like it's always addressing the same cohort of people, the same group of people, in the way that the messaging is.
And where do you think that's coming from? So is that at a is that within the community level? Is that the government talking to the community? Where do you sort of feel that?
It's a good question. I think there's a flow on, and it's possible that it starts with government. It's possible that it starts with the people who begin doing the work, and then people follow suit. They carry on with it. But I think a good comparison would be for us to look at, for instance, messaging around smoking. That's changed significantly over time. It used to be that we would see a lot of the advertisements showing a diseased lung, a doctor dissecting a diseased lung, seeing all the tar coming out of the diseased lung, is to fear you out of smoking. Whereas there had been a shift later on to be more positive messaging. Why? Because they're looking and saying, well, is this effective? Is this the right way to approach the community? People who are suffering from being addicted to smoking and addicted to cigarettes. I think it was looked more like even the perpetrator is in a sense a victim, a victim of their own doing, really. And so I think it's worthwhile for us to take a look at the overall messaging when it comes to domestic violence and see who are we addressing, who's effective with, and who maybe not effective with. Interestingly, if you look at any kind of engagement, interaction, it's an attempt to influence. And influence isn't always bad, because we often try to influence people to do something positive. We're coming together to have this discussion because we were trying to have a positive influence, right? And people communicate in various ways. And people in a relationship, they're trying to navigate the relationship. And so if you restrict their avenues for how to communicate, and we're looking at now the way domestic violence is viewed, like the term, and how the definition continues to be expanded, and there's so many things that can be considered domestic violence. A person from a low socioeconomic background, or maybe not, has not been quite as educated, they might feel like they're quite confined and restricted, and there's not much they can do in terms of influence and really navigating through a relationship.
Yeah. No, I think the point that's really interesting that both of you have sort of touched on is that there's a lot that happens to get, there's a lot that could happen to get someone to the point that they commit acts that may be viewed as domestic violence. That there's a lot of their own trauma and baggage and background that's happening, which sometimes many people in our community may be carrying. And so instead of dealing with positive ways of healing that or addressing that through whatever way that may be, whether that's through counseling or through, therapy or whatever, when you start comparing between, upper middle class white society, which has had it great for generations and generations, and then a migrant society which is fleeing from war and all sorts of turbulence and so forth, and you're saying, aha, why aren't you the model sort of citizen? Then naturally it's going to be very, very easy to find your, and of course, as we all know, with terrorism or with any other political or social problem, you pick out the instances of where things happen, and then you tar the whole community with that on that basis.
And that's despite the fact that you do get white males, all the stories all the time of them being
literally
involved,
murdering, and so I think it's the politicization of the issue, and I think in my experience in the community is that a lot of brothers who feel, let's just say, hard done by on this issue on the issue of domestic violence, and often it is brothers who've gone through, let's say, acrimonious divorces, right, where accusations have been hurled about what they have done, and it may not be necessarily domestic violence, but there's a question mark that hangs over them. Now, I've had some discussion with those sorts of brothers. Like, it is impossible for me to convince my own family or definitely my ex-in-laws or the rest of our friend circle or whatever that I was innocent or I wasn't, an abuser of some sort, because the assumption is that I'm Muslim, right? There's this issue always being discussed. I must be the abuser, and it was my fault, and so forth. So, and I think when you look at the broader context of how Muslim men have been positioned as the aggressor in many cases, I think this is what all gets all moshed up together to have brothers feeling that way. And I think it's an interesting and important segue into the next question, which basically, and I want to raise with both of you, and we'll start with Sheikh Jamal again, is what are your experiences dealing with domestic and family violence in the context of brothers, whether they be victims or perpetrators, right? And perhaps, I guess, if there's instances where you've, let's say, when I say perpetrators, let's put it in the context of where the person in the relationship, the wife or the ex-wife or the spouse, has mentioned that the husband abused me, or he was a perpetrator of domestic violence. In that particular instance, when you speak to brothers or when you hear the other side, what is the sense that you get from brothers? Is there a sense like we're very easily being thrown under the bus here? It's very convenient to sort of make this accusation in this day and age. There's no sense of parity in the conversation. Is that a sense that you get that we sometimes pick up from conversations in the community?
All right. So first of all, I mean, I have basically interacted with brothers who were sort of on the receiving end, and I mean, for the most part, it's not a case of a distinct, once again, it's not necessarily a distinct perpetrator and victim. There are some cases and really severe cases of that, but for the most part, when basically a husband and wife become estranged, there's I guess some level of abuse that's basically mutual and exchanged. But yeah, I know or have interacted with brothers where basically they were suicidal because the wife took the kids. He hasn't seen the kids in 3 years. I mean, a divorce happened, and I just was trying to console him because he was just broken. He was absolutely broken because the wife had taken the kids and gone. Even breaching court orders. So he wasn't even in line with sort of court ruling. So there was that. But at the same time, I've also there have been instances where the brother was, for the most part, the perpetrator. In fact, severely victimizing the wife and justifying it because like she made me do it, and she asked for it. Sort of along those lines. And just completely, looking at his rights. Emphasizing that look, she disobeyed me, and look, she's required Islamically to obey, and because she failed, look, she asked for it, and I have to teach her a lesson. So it's sort of that, that happening. So that's sort of on the other extreme. It's not one. There's a continuum of victim and perpetrator. There's no distinct dichotomy, really.
And Sheikh Mohammed, what would you say? What have you seen and heard?
Well, I mean, I've seen a range. Again, it's like Sheikh Jamal was saying, and this is me not even like specifically working in the space. So like I'm not working as a counselor, but in my job in the community as an imam, and even like I said, this is one of the reasons why actually I enjoy taking public transport, because you actually get to see a lot of what happens in the community, and I mean, I've seen a couple who had historically been, or they weren't a couple at the time, but they wanted to remarry, and historically there was domestic violence between them. And that was a difficult conversation to just try and help the wife understand. This is what you're getting back into. Can you be actually sure that, you know, are you confident that you're not going to go back into an abusive relationship, a problematic relationship? And that was one relating to them living in the in-laws' house, and like and them like a very problematic family dynamic. So I mean, you have that. You have instances. I mean, subhanallah, like someone came to me one time. And she was saying her husband, he gave her a behavior contract that he wanted her to sign. First time I had heard anything like that. I found that very strange. So I sat down with her, had a conversation. We tried to work through it, inshallah, and offered her some advice. It's harder when you only have one side, like when you're only talking to one side of the relationship.
Sounds like a very elaborate adab card.
And I said, look, even if you do sign it, it's not binding. It's not going to cost you anything if you break it. And then you have, like, in the why I mentioned public transport is, I mean, I've been on the bus where I've seen instances of like person going overboard, like when he's talking to his girlfriend. Like, I don't even know if the guy's Muslim really, but talking to his girlfriend in a particular way, I had to say something. Like, and subhanallah, several months later, I think it was the exact same guy. He came onto the bus, and there was a different girl. It was a different girl this time. And as we're on the bus, like, you hear the way he's talking is very forceful in his speech, like very aggressive. And it seemed like there was an escalation. So it was just like, okay, somewhat aggressive. Some people talk in a rough manner, you know. But it seemed like the language was escalating, and I had to say something. And now it turned into a confrontation. So you have to consider as well the way you talk to people sometimes, because that guy, like, it's none of your business. What are you doing? It's between me and my girlfriend, and it turns into a thing. I said to the guy, "Do I need to stay on the bus, like, to make sure nothing happens here?" But so you do have, like, you do have a range, and it's really complex. Like, you're dealing with relationships, and the scope for relationships has grown so much within our society because we live within a secular, non-Islamic society, and a lot of it's okay within that society, not so in Islam, of course.
Very interesting question raised by, in fact, I just want to give a shout out to two people who've commented so far. Brother Abu Jibril says, Salam, please ask both brothers not to buckle and not to worry about being too politically correct, and just say it how it is, no matter who gets offended, men or women. We need to talk we need to have real talk on the matter. Exactly what you're going to do.
Absolutely.
Sister Jenny Bryant from Melbourne mentions, hope you're well. Mentions domestic violence. This is a very, very interesting question. I think very, very good for us to look at. Domestic violence is often linked to toxic masculinity, which is harmful not just to women, but also to men. Can the panel comment about the Islamic perspective on masculinity and how it is similar to or differs to the broader definition of toxic masculinity? So I think this is a fantastic question, right? It gets to what I mentioned at the start, the whole sort of the culture wars, the gender wars, and you know what it means to be a man and all that sort of stuff.
And what's the definition?
What's the definition?
So
yeah,
that's the
let's start with you, Sheikh.
Definition.
Yeah.
I don't want to. I mean, if you have a definition, you know, I think that could be a starting point.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
Okay, so Islam has a concept of rajula. There's a concept of masculinity,
right?
That Islam has. To what extent do you think the way that the West expects a man to behave is in line with how Islam expects a man to behave? Let's use that as a starting point.
Okay, well, I mean, of course, you know, within Islam, you know, there's the concept of qawama, there's a concept of, you know, the fact that, and for our viewers, qawama meaning... Yeah, qawama, basically guardianship, authority within the marriage, you know, so there is that concept. He does, you know, basically also have the ultimate meaning that, like, you know, he has, you know, the final say on, in general, he has the final say on the future of the marriage. You know, if he wants to unilaterally divorce, he can. If the wife, you know, the wife generally cannot, you know, unilaterally divorce. You know, so there's that as well, and there's also the fact that, you know, the wife is obligated to obey her husband, of course, with conditions within a certain under certain exactly but also it's got to be the obedience has to be relevant to the marriage itself, and it's got to be without disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She doesn't have to obey him in terms of her finances. He doesn't have to, like if he asks her to transfer all her finances to his account, she doesn't have to obey that. In fact, he's obligated to support her financially in terms of accommodation, in terms of living essentials. She doesn't have to pay a cent for rent, like that. So there is an asymmetry in terms of obligations and rights, but we believe that it is the best system. Yes. So
what about some of the softer characteristics? Let's talk about
so that's in the context of like masculinity is much broader than just the.
So let's talk more broadly than the marriage.
So outside of that, I mean, I just feel like it's sort of digressing. I mean, like we're talking about
let's digress because I think it's important because what this is, I guess, what I want to get to eventually is things like aggression, right? And how a certain type of behavior, which is associated with masculinity in the West, is not necessarily behavior that Islam condones. Outside of the battlefield, for example, or with the kuffar or whatever. And I just want to sort of dive into that a little bit because I think there's a lot of overlap. And in some of the defense we see of certain types of behavior, even amongst our sort of brothers in the community, there's often a departure from what Islam would have people behave like, including men. Right? So tell us a bit more about what does a good man in Islam look like?
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. You have in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam the best of examples, and like when we look at his dealings with his wives and his dealings with female sahabiyat, we don't see that toxicity, but then like how do you define that? So there was softness, there was as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in terms of treating wives وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, there was that. And also when there was disagreement, it's not like the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's interaction with his wives was conflict free. There were times where there were disagreements, and then one conflict was the sabab nuzul of a particular verse in Surah Al-Ahzab where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells his Prophet, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّبِيُّ قُلْ لِأَزْوَاجِكَ إِن كُنتُنَّ تُرِيدْنَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا وَزِينَتَهَا فَتَعَالَيْنَ أُمَتِّعْكُنَّ وَأُسَرِّحْكُنَّ سَرَاحًا جَمِيلًا. Basically, like what some of the wives of the Prophet, I believe it was Hafsa, she was asking for a bit more financial support. Even though the Prophet, he wasn't the most, in fact, he hardly had any finances, but she nonetheless asked, and it was her right. But then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed the Prophet if you to tell them if you wish if you desire and aspire to this world, let me basically divorce you, but look at the way it was expressed, let you go and set you free in a way that is beautiful, so like that just shows you that like even when conflict does occur, sometimes some marriages are untenable, and sometimes it's almost like Allah is saying, if you, a prophet, can't do justice to her, then tell her you'll let her go for her sake. Almost. In a way that's amicable, in a way that's not in a way that is abusive. Like not. And that's the thing, like when it comes to divorce, like the assumption is it's messy showdown, like that's what's the common impression of divorce. But it could be in the most amicable of terms, and it does happen, alhamdulillah. But we don't hear those stories. Like the stories that end up on social media is like just a massive showdown, like a wife taking the husband to court and just stripping him of all his rights, or the husband completely destroying the woman's self-worth, or like abusing the deen and manipulating it in the worst way possible. That's we hear the extreme and the most abusive of stories. We don't hear the more amicable. That's the thing.
Sheikh Mohammed, what would you add to that in terms of what Islam expects the man to be, whether in marriage or more generally?
So I completely agree with the question about what does it actually mean, toxic masculinity. But we can talk about what masculinity is in Islam. And I think part of it does change a little bit with time. I mean, تخضع للعرف. It's custom does affect what masculinity might look like, what femininity might look like. But not too much. I mean, you still say it still clearly looks like masculinity, and still looks like femininity for a woman. But as Sheikh Jamal mentioned as well, like we can see it in the seerah. We can see it in the lives of the Sahaba. We can see it with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, "ليس القوي فيكم بالسرعة، إنما القوي الذي يملك نفسه عند الغضب. And so what he's telling you is that the strong person is not the one who can physically overwhelm others. It's a person who can overwhelm himself. His own anger, he can control it, he can keep it in. He can keep it in, control his own anger. If you can overcome yourself, then you are strong. Overcome your ego, overcome your inclinations, overcome the desire to let go and unleash upon somebody. That's the proper strength.
Yeah, and in the specific context of marriage, you have the hadith, خيركم خيركم لأهله وأنا خيركم لأهلي. That Prophet said that the best of you men is the best of you to his wives. Like ahl, generally can apply to household, but mainly it tends to be a reference to wives, and I am the best of you to his wives. So that's just, I guess, to further that and
we
apply
hear this
to
hadith so often.
Before
We hear this hadith so often, but I think when you really ponder on it, it's not the best of you is the one who has memorized the most Quran or has attained the most religious titles, or the most wealth, or whatever. It really is in the conduct of the family, which is pretty mind blowing if you think of it.
Well, I mean, often there's a lot of hadiths with those sort of superlative terms, but in the context of marriage, that's the best of you. That's what it is. Yeah, and as well, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
So Sheikh,
so there is strength as well. I mean, we see in the saying of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, إذا حمي الوطيس احتمينا برسول الله. When we get into the heat of battle, we used to seek safety beside the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he had that bravery, he had that courage. Bravery and courage is commendable in Islam, and it is a form of masculinity. But just like with any characteristic, any trait, it needs to be put in the right place. It needs to be put. You're qawi and you're shuja', you're strong and you're brave. Fil haqq, in the truth, in its rightful place, inshallah.
And I think this is then what leads to, what is not masculinity that is derived from Islam, and therefore what is toxic masculinity. I mean, toxic masculinity is a term that comes from the broader conversation around gender in the West, right? It's not something you'll find in our tradition, but I think from our from the perspective of what that phrase is getting at, it's basically saying a form of masculinity which is replete with toxicity, which is condemnable behavior, right? Condemnable behavior, anger, aggression, etc. And I mean, I would sort of suggest that there's overlaps there with our deen in terms of our deen has problems with that stuff too,
of course,
right? It's just that, of course, what people sort of departing from that discourse would deem toxic may differ for them from what it does for us. So, for instance, any form of control may, in the broader conversation, be toxic. Whereas, as you just said, Sheikh Jamal, there are, if the husband says in certain affairs, this is how it is and that is how it is, and that's not toxic at all.
That's right.
And so, I think tying it all up together, really, what it is masculinity from an Islamic perspective looks like trying to be like the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in everything that we do.
He's at the role model in all aspects. In terms of, especially like interpersonal relations. You can't necessarily get that. In some cases, just from a hadith. You need to look at his conduct, how it was manifested in his action and in his conduct and interaction with his wives, for example, in this particular case. And I think I have a problem with these terms that tend to be thrown around, especially when it's used as a label, toxic, narcissist, feminist, and sometimes even misogynist. And really it brings to mind the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب. We read this in Surah Al-Hujurat. Do not throw around slanderous labels. Not necessarily slanderous. It's not in that it doesn't apply altogether, but it's basically a negative label that it harms more than it benefits. It's not useful. Sometimes a person does exhibit narcissistic traits. But it doesn't mean let's label the person. It's become the new takfir almost.
100%. And it almost forestalls any possibility of discussion in that particular instance. If
the aim is to heal, if the aim is to have a constructive dialogue, it blocks that.
What I would like to offer in that regard is look at the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. أتدرون من المفلس? I don't know if you've read the hadith. Do you know who the bankrupt person is? Like for me, and it should be for every single Muslim, male or female. Like you want to be able to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment and you haven't wronged anyone. And the Prophet ﷺ doesn't. Do you know who the bankrupt person is? And the Sahaba, of course, they're going to answer the simple answer, like the known answer. The person bankrupt, one of us, one who has no dirham or dinar, who has no money. And he said, "Muflisu fikum yawm al-qiyamah, man yati yawm al-qiyamah." On the day of judgment, this is the bankrupt person. He comes on the day of judgment with the reward of his fasting and his salah and his charity. And it's men and women. So I'm saying he because we often, when we talk, we use the masculine form, but it usually encompasses both. There's all the reward. You could have mountains of hasanat from your salah and your zakat and your siyam. ويكون قد ضرب هذا وشتم هذا وأكل مال هذا فيؤخذ منه ويعطى لهذا. And so he's got all this reward from his acts of worship, but at the same time he's hurt so and so, and he has unjustly eaten the wealth of so and so, and he has cursed so and so. And so all these ways that you've wronged other people, they're going to take from you. They're going to take from you when it matters. And you hit this life, it doesn't matter like the next life. And so I think this is what we all need to consider for ourselves. Like every single Muslim needs to consider this. Like, what's going to be my scale on the day of judgment? People are going to be lining up waiting to take from my scale because I wronged them in some way.
That's a very, very profound point. And so I think tying it back to the discussion we were just having, it's like, toxic masculinity then, for the purposes of our discussion, from an Islamic perspective anyway, is that manifestation of masculinity which departs from the deen, right? Yeah. And obviously that's different to how we're going to see this.
With women it's the same.
Yeah, just make that in the criteria in the story.
Yes, absolutely. And so, the sister was asking, and I know we've spent a bit of time on this, but it relates to so much of the conversation that was to come. What is the impact of this on men themselves? How has it perverted their own sense of what they should aspire to be like, I suppose? And then, of course, women, in the form of men having toxic traits and then thinking that they're doing something noble, but the impact of that on women. So, and let's look at both of those. Let's look at men first. How do we feel this has harmed our brothers who may be sort of aspiring to certain forms of masculinity, which are from outside the deen? And to your point before, Sheikh Jamal, about sometimes they're victims themselves, right? Even the perpetrators can be victims in this case because they're, I guess, losing the benefit of behaving like Rasulullah would expect us to behave. So tell us about that a little bit.
I mean, typically, what we're faced with is, a traumatized person, especially like, when it's a husband traumatizing, someone else, especially the wife who typically has less power in the marriage or in the relationship, So, that's sort of the way I tend to look at things. But yeah, like in terms of, again, people need to realign their masculinity with the way of the Prophet ﷺ. That's really the bottom line in terms of his akhlaq, in terms of, his dealing with Aisha radiallahu anha. He would often, like there's certain hadith where, there would be softness, like he would place his, head in Aisha's lap, for example, hadiths to that effect, and like that's in complete contrast to how people would perceive, the alpha male dealing with the wife, like the wife is supposed to be his subordinate, that notion isn't found in the Sirah. Yes, the husband has certain rights and there is an asymmetry, but it comes also with financial obligations that and the wife has no financial obligation in the marriage whatsoever, and Allah says, when we often, the problem is attributed to qawama, but then, if you read the ayah completely, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. And the ba here is, it's referred to in Nahw as ba al-muqabala, meaning that it's one thing for another, so the qawama comes with the financial obligation, the entire financial obligation of supporting a wife in her essentials, in her accommodation and everything. So there is an asymmetry, but there's no injustice, and this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law after all, so
so I think this happens in company, like for the most part. It's like how you want people to view you. Like, I don't take nonsense from anyone, right? And my wife knows her place with me. Like in the privacy of your own home, nobody sees you, nobody cares. And so I think it's less likely, unless you're trying to prove something really, or my husband doesn't tell me what to do. He can never tell me what to do. I'll do what I want, I'll pull him by his strings, So I think this is kind of thing a person might fall into in company when they're trying to boast about something. We know the boasting is haram in Islam, and it's something people should avoid really, like to the best of their ability, especially in company. And here we have like situations where the community is actually harming relationships, and people shouldn't actually put up with that. Like if you see that in somebody, they shouldn't put up with that. You should remind them, like, is this how the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was? I still remember to this day, subhanallah. I was in Lebanon still studying. I was having lunch with with family, and one of my uncles, he's a bit of a smart aleck. He said something that I responded to, and I responded to, I wanted to have it with him, have an argument with him, and he just looks at me and says, "Is this the way the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have responded?" That was enough for me. Like that was enough for me. And I think this is something that we need to do for ourselves within our communities. Is it the way the Prophet ﷺ wants us to behave? Is it the way he wants us to interact? Is it the way he wants us to be within our relationships? Like Islam is submission. Like you're submitting to the will of Allah Azza wa Jal. Like you're standing before Allah later on, and you're like, this was the state of your relationship. Yeah.
I think, I mean, this is sort of a digression, but like I think really what has led to all this tension, between men and women is just individualism. I think that's one of the main culprits. It's become my rights, your rights, and then always a discussion on the men's right or the husband's rights in the Sharia versus the woman's rights. And we forget the original spirit of a marriage. That is relevant in the context of conflict, but then by default, the original spirit, or the way we should frame marriage is مودة ورحمة. ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها, the sakina, وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة. It should be like a companionship. It should be like there should be softness. There should you should be able to be like muck around with your wife. So that's the default. That's how a marriage is supposed to be by default Islamically. But then yes, when there's conflict, yes, then we refer to, in that particular instance, we refer to the rights and responsibilities. That's a different story.
Absolutely. I think it's a very profound point. There's some other comments and questions coming in, which I will, in the interest of keeping the episode quite live, I do want to read them. I know we're sort of veering away from some of the questions we came up with. The sister also mentioned, what about, I'm interested in the concept of masculinity outside of the marriage, and how, in broader sort of society, there's often like this elevation of the male being a certain way when it comes to emotions and not showing emotion, for example. What about the Islamic perspective on it, or the Islamic concept of the male? Is he required to bottle things up and be stern? And
the Prophet ﷺ openly shed tears when his son Ibrahim passed away, and then he said, "Inna al-'ayna la tadma' wa inna al-qalba la yahzan wa inna ala firaqika ya Ibrahim la mahzunun." So there was that. He would weep. He wept on various occasions, and this is all conveyed and reported in the Sunnah. So there was that. And the Sahaba would hug. There wasn't this bottling up of emotions at all, and that really is a foreign concept, and that's what's making people brothers just become psychologically warped, and it manifests itself. It basically backfires, or it affects those around them, especially in the domestic setting, in terms of the way they deal with their wives and their children. So
so I think in a way, or to a degree, that is the case. Like we do learn that the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba at times cried, and sometimes like profusely, like after the Battle of Hunayn with the Ansar, after his speech to the Ansar, they were all crying, and all of them together as a large group. But I think also we need to keep in mind that males and females are different, and what might work for females might not work for males. And so we should take that into consideration when we talk about how we're going to help males deal with certain issues, deal with certain struggles or certain traumas and whatnot. Interestingly, one of the things that we learn in education is that young men, they don't like looking you in the eye, and sometimes they view it as a form of aggression, whereas with girls it's different. And so I think we do need to consider the potential for difference, and how maybe we should frame our language and our approach differently when we want to help people get through certain troubles and certain difficulties.
Some very good interaction questions coming. So I'm going to go back to some of our questions that we had discussed previously, but then I'll pick some of these up a little bit later in the episode, inshallah. Let's talk about the way that the domestic and family violence topic is often framed in broader society and beginning to happen in our community. When I know, Sheikh Mohammed, to start with you, I know in our previous discussions that you take some umbrage with this, like you have an issue with it. Tell us about your perspective on this issue in terms of how this issue is sometimes being.
Sorry, can you the issue?
So the topic of family and domestic violence, the way that it is framed, right, the language that is used, the logic behind it. What are some of the issues and problems with how you see things being at the current time?
Yeah, so I touched on it very briefly earlier on in the discussion, and that's in the sense that when I was saying that I don't think it's significantly more in the Muslim community, but rather we should look at socioeconomics and how different socioeconomic status might see different prevalence of domestic violence. You got to understand your target audience. You need to understand the target audience. You need to understand what kind of language works with them. You need to understand that actually they're navigating a relationship. So you can't just take all their tools away from them and give them nothing in return. And so if you're trying to help them live a healthy, and look, these tools, I'm not saying these tools are good, like if they're being abusive, I'm not saying the tools are good, but what I'm saying is when you take those tools away, you have to give them tools that will work within that relationship, that will make things, help them to live a happy, peaceful life with their spouse, with their children, if we're talking about children in the relationship as well. I think it would serve everybody. And look, we know that a lot of funding comes to the way of domestic violence, dealing with domestic violence. So I think we can afford to look and see, maybe we can try to identify ways to tackle this actually earlier on, like before the relationship is a complete mess. And so, one of the things that we like doing with people, and like I encourage people in the community to do all the time, is if you see newlyweds, like prop them up. If you see people who their relationship's a bit shaky, like you talk positively about the person's partner in front of them. Like help them feel a sense of respect and pride that, I married a good person, I married a decent person. Of course, it's kind of like, you might say it case by case, but generally you know the people around you. And you know what is helpful to them, what is beneficial to them, and what may not be. But like our goal, all of us, should be to help our relationships thrive and succeed. This is our future. Like broken homes, like there are many statistics on the damage done. Like a person growing up in a broken home is sometimes inevitable. Like we're not saying you can't ever end the relationship, because sometimes remaining in the relationship can be more damaging. Like we're not saying that, but overall, generally, growing up in a broken home, it has costs. And sometimes quite heavy costs. So we want relationships to thrive, and if we can do anything, even if something small, paying a compliment, helping with bills, like when they struggle a little bit, then we should do that. Like subhanAllah, like we talk about negative cases that came away, but we have some positive ones too. So subhanAllah, like I see there's a young man, subhanAllah, gave me a call a few weeks ago. He said, Sheikh, look, I just want to know, and his wife was sitting next to him. Like a young couple, subhanAllah, they're trying to navigate through life, like trying to make the relationship work, trying to make everything work for themselves. It's like, Sheikh, I just want to know, like, if somebody starts backbiting against you, like your whole family, everyone's backbiting against you, can you backbite against them back? Like, can you say bad things about them in return? And I quoted something from Wajdi Ghanem. I don't know if any of the listeners or yourself know who Wajdi Ghanem is.
Yes.
Like he's well known in the Arab world.
Very well known.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because he visited Lebanon once, and he gave a talk, and he was talking about this back and forth, like between people, and he said, well, people ask me, like, if somebody harmed me, can I harm them back? And he said, look, like, if you want adl and qisas, yes, you can, but like, I'll give you an example. If someone said to you, ya hmar, you don't go back and say to them, لا أنت 10 حمار. You don't, or أنت 100 حمار. You don't, like someone says to you, you're a donkey. Like you don't say, oh no, you're 100 donkeys. Like you have to do it properly and in like something that's measured. Like you don't take your rights and then more. But I said to the couple, I said, this is not the way to do it. Like don't go. And like it was the young woman. Like people in her extended family were gossiping about her, backbiting. She was really furious, really upset. And so I just gave them, some hadith, some pieces of advice, just to help them to calm down and help them to understand, what's a good way forward in relation to that. And they did, looked like they received the advice really well. And this should be our approach with all relationships. Like we want them to thrive. And even when I say this, like sometimes you see a couple, they're getting engaged, they're about to get married, and you think to yourself, that doesn't look like a good match. Right, but I think this is one of the occasions, and for me as well. Like this is one of the occasions where I want to be proven wrong. Like not where I want to be proven right, and so I can say I told you so. Where I want to be proven wrong, and they can show me, or they show whoever, that actually they can make it work.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Sheikh?
So the question was.
So the question was just, like the way that the issue is framed, and how we should sort of go about perhaps tackling it a different way. So in this instance, where where there's so much focus on, I guess, the rights for one party, like the women in this instance, and there's almost like a troubleshooting of, when is the man abusive, or can be sort of, I guess a case can be made for divorce or for him to be branded an abuser or whatever. How should we approach that from a logic perspective?
We can do away with all the, sort of domestic violence language, and we can just stick to the qawaid and the usul of the deen, so like, there is a very famous maxim within fiqh, which is la darar wa la dirar, which happens to also be the verbatim hadith, a hadith, basically verbatim. There should be no harm, nor a reciprocation of harm, and in the context of marriage, it applies both ways, so, that to me, as far as I'm concerned, that covers all sorts of abuse, whether it's financial, psychological, emotional, so, if you're not happy with the DV language, fine. Let's just stick with the language of the deen. I don't know how you're going to translate it while avoiding the
trappings
sort
of that conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. So
it comes to an issue, and I was discussing this with our sheikhs just earlier before this episode. And I want to bring in another comment that was made on a discussion forum by a sheikh in Melbourne, who's quite active in some of these topics. Assalamu alaikum, sheikh, if you're watching, good to have you with us. He made the comment, and it comes to this issue of language and the conversation being brought in from other parts of society and so forth. And he said, the disproportionate coverage now given to the domestic violence issue, and the way that it is, and the emphasis on certain issues is by now quite clear. Right? Largely, it is a reproduction of issues important in current identity politics, prevalent in liberal discourse, meaning in the rest of society, and obviously pushed by a certain part of society. To what degree do you both agree with the sentiment? And I think we've actually got a bit of I was going to say, how do we sort of navigate our way around this as a community? And I think you've sort of spoken to it, right?
Yeah.
And we've sort of got into the crux of it. But before we get to that and just reaffirm that, because I think it's a very important point to take away from today. Do share with me your thoughts on, is that what's happening in some segments of our community? Are people just taking a conversation from elsewhere, bringing it in, and then popularizing it without being tethered to the deen, perhaps? Sheikh Mohammed.
Yeah, so I do think there's a bit of a saturation there, and I think I'm trying to understand the message of the Sheikh, and I do appreciate his comments actually. I think it's he's talking about priorities. And like I said, there's a saturation. There's a lot of talk about it's showing up in all of our feeds, and numerous different organizations are doing work in this space. And I believe there's a lot of funding that's coming this way, and it's drowning out some of the other important issues. So I think that's more what it's like. And if we look at, and again,
let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
What if someone else to say, but that's because the issue is bad, and so the attention that it's getting is overdue?
Well, other issues are also bad. And we're not going to play the game of which one is worse, but we're going to talk about which issues are deserving of our attention. And it is deserving of our attention to a degree, but we've got such a saturation, whereas at the same time we've been saying in our discussion that we don't think that Islam makes a person particularly susceptible to domestic violence, like being Muslim. In fact, the more adherent they are to their religion should mean that they're less likely to participate in this. So the question is about priorities, and I think it was Al-Izz bin Abd Salam rahimahullah who said, "Man dakhala qaryatan." I don't remember the exact quote. It's on my phone.
يعني يعمل فيها بالربا فحدثهم عن
فخاطبهم عن الزنا فقد خان أمانة الله ورسوله. So if he enters a town and he finds that riba is widespread, usury is widespread, and he gives them a speech about zina, about adultery or fornication, then he has betrayed the trust that is given to him by Allah and His Messenger. And so I think it's a discussion about priorities. And again, that's not to say, and I don't like to caveat, to be honest with you, I don't like to do caveats, but again, this is not to say that this matter is unimportant. But what it's looking like to a lot of people is that it's drowning out, it's taking up all the space of other conversations, which are actually quite important as well. And so Islam has very clear stances, and I know I'm talking about something else here. Has very clear stance in relation to gender identity and gender norms, and what is considered a halal relationship and what is considered a haram or forbidden relationship. And I think there's a sentiment within a number of people in our community, and I think it's significant enough sentiment that this topic is not sufficiently discussed.
Yeah, I find the common refrain. I mean, the way there's that refrain on DV is often made about mental health, and everything's mental health now. What's going on? Like everyone's got some sort of trauma. Everyone's got, sure. So I think it's not exclusive to DV. It's also with other things, and there's often, I'm not aware of DV being at the very top. It's given more coverage than other issues like mental health, like addictions, substance abuse,
drugs,
pornography, all these other things are being raised, and I'm not aware of, personally. I mean, it's just from where I stand, I don't see that being, pushed to the very top, in relation to the other things.
Could it just be that it attracts controversy because there's two genders sometimes being pitted against each other?
Yeah.
And in broader liberal conversation.
I think what we're talking about is just feminism, the issue of feminism, gender roles, it's departing from DV per se, so.
Sure. Yeah, that's a different point.
Yeah.
Possible.
Yeah.
But I won't discard that point.
Yeah.
So language is quite powerful in these social issues, right? And some brothers out there complain that words are being taken from outside the Islamic tradition and being brought into it, and then value judgments are being attributed to those words, right, or to certain things. And I'll give an example in a second. Do you think this is a fair criticism of the conversations that are being had? And how bad is the problem? So I'll take an example of words like abuse or neglect or violence, right? Where it's basically like these are common terms in vogue in these conversations, and if they're beginning to be used in the context of our relationships, and there's already a value judgment attaching to that, how could you be negligent to me in this regard? Or you are abusing me, say, psychologically or spiritually, which is now a new form of, a recognized form of abuse. You're doing this and you're doing this, therefore you are so bad, right? But the logic and the language being used is in relation to actions which Islam may not consider problematic. Like if the husband tells his wife to pray, for example, whatever the case may be. And I've heard some pretty bizarre things in this regard. And there may be extreme cases, just to be sure. May not be that that any sister who raises that issue is raising that sort of logic. No. But to what extent do you think elements of our community may have inherited this and have been a little bit, convenient in doing this too readily? What do we think? And I think the parallel I have is to the thing like narcissist, for example, right? Where people see this phrase and now it's being bandied about left, right, and centre, and value judgments are being made on that basis. What would your thoughts be, Sheikh Mohammed? Maybe I'll start with you.
Actually, I really appreciate your comment there because I didn't actually look at it in that way, but you're absolutely right. Like in terms of value attribution, like to a particular label. And I think Sheikh Jamal touched on that before. I think it has potential to be problematic. The way that I viewed that question when I was taking a look at it was in terms of the fiqh, and that's not to say that we can't use those terms, but like for us as fuqaha, if that label applies to us, we have to see whether, like when we're looking at a relationship, whether khulu' can apply or fasakh can apply, like the breaking of a marriage contract can apply. We have to understand, does it meet the actual conditions for that? Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I say, like, on my own, like if I say that, okay, your marriage is annulled, I've broken your marriage contract. If it doesn't meet the conditions, that means with Allah, it's still, you're still married in the eyes of Allah. And so I have to make sure that it actually meets the conditions, and that's why I have to be careful with the terminology that's used. And so I can't just take that on face value. Someone is saying my partner is being abusive. My partner is, has exercised financial abuse in relation to me, or has exercised physical. Whatever the terminology is. Like I have to understand, does it actually meet our conditions, like as Muslims? And so, and sometimes it can be frustrating for people. They'll be like, "Oh, can't you just give me the stamp of approval? Like we already determined this. We can't do that, like because it's not in our hands. We have to understand the matter, understand the situation, and then see does it fit the requirements, and then say approved or not approved.
Sheikh Jamal, in your work with the LMA, you obviously see quite a few of these, as you mentioned at the top of the episode, divorce applications or sort of relationship related issues. Talk to us about brothers' actions in marriage and sisters' actions in marriage. Talk to us a little bit more about your experience, further to what you already mentioned before, and what are your reflections on sort of what you're seeing there, just very generally.
Yeah, I mean, so once again, I mean, for the most part, often, most. I guess estranged spouses, they tend to be caught in a situation of resentment. There's just a build-up of resentment, and some form of abuse. You could, I guess apply labels, to certain things that are sometimes done by the man and sometimes by the woman. And not to say there's an equivalence necessarily. Sometimes the man is really much more abusive than the wife, but then the wife is reacting, or sometimes it's vice versa. So it's sort of. It's much more than just a distinct. Once again, much more. complex generally than just a distinct perpetrator and a distinct victim. But I mean, I just wanted to sort of touch on the issue of language. So like personally, like in terms of the terms abuse, neglect, I think by default, or in and of themselves, they're quite value free. But then they can obviously be applied in a way that's contrary to the Sharia. So like the issue of abuse, al-adha, like abuse can be translated to it, or can be a translation of al-adha, and al-adha is found quite it's quite predominant in the literature or in the usage of the fuqaha. And there's also in terms of neglect, there is tafriq, there is also the issue of tadiyya. There is in fact a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he says kafa bil mar'i ithman an yudayya man ya'ul, that it's sufficient sin on a person, especially like a man, and yudayya, to neglect those in his care. Like a man is, especially a father, is responsible for his dependents. So that sort of neglect, it's I guess affirmed by the Sharia. And basically, like with any language you use, like you can always qualify it, just for good measure with in accordance with the Sharia.
So and it breaks that problem, isn't it?
That's it. So I guess that responds to both questions. Kind of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's very, very good. So let's there's a few questions coming up on the feed as well.
Okay.
Let's Sheikh Mohammed, wanted to ask you about this one. Okay. So in your capacity as an imam and also someone sort of learning Islamic law and giving advice on its basis, you are seeing quite a few things on the ground. Let's dive into one element specifically. What are you hearing from some brothers in relation to some of the questions we've been addressing today, the unheard part, right? Which is there a sense from people that you speak to in the community, brothers, that really do feel unheard and they feel like their side of the story is unappreciated? Maybe they've been on the receiving end, and of course there are treatments, and I'll dive into one question that a sister actually raised. They've been on the receiving end of bad treatment from their wife, for example. Do they feel like it's not even worth me trying to seek justice from my, and we all live in social bubbles, right? With my family, with my friends. The minute anyone's raised a complaint about me in a marital situation, I have straight away been tarred as the wrong person because of the tide and which way it's going in society at the moment. Do you get that sentiment from brothers?
So some, and I'll mention in the way that the cases have actually come to me. I think the understanding is that when a woman is in a similar situation, and here we're not talking just about within the Muslim community, but also when it comes to seeking help outside the Muslim community, whether it's through the courts or the police, that people are far more ready to help and assist when it comes to women than it is with them. That's the feeling. I'm not saying that this is the reality. I'm saying this is the feeling, and as a result of the feeling, you see that they are kind of forgotten to a degree. So subhanAllah, we had a brother who, their relationship has had its ups and downs. They were married for 15 years. He had two kids between them, and the wife, at some point in the relationship, early on in the relationship, she decided, I'm going to record an instance of domestic abuse, just in case. And 15 years into the relationship, she used it. And from there was the marriage breakdown. He moved out of the house. One of the children is staying with him. The other one the wife is keeping the child from him. He's looking at his situation. He's like there are plenty of times that she was abusive to me, and she physically abused me. But I never imagined that I would need to actually save or record something just in case I needed to defend myself. And so there's one. There's another gentleman who was married for 16 or 17 years, 7 kids between him and his wife, and he's in a situation where he feels like he can't see any of his children. They're all with his wife. He feels like they're going backwards in terms of their deen and even in terms of their academic ability and stuff like that. He tries to get information from the schools, but the schools sometimes they don't release the information to him. And after all the discussion, I said to him, brother, do you think that perhaps going to the court might give you an opportunity to see your children? He can't imagine taking his wife to court. Like in his mind, he can't imagine doing that to someone, to someone he's lived his life with. And so especially that second example doesn't quite fit in being unheard, but it's kind of like this disparity, a disparity between the two genders in relation to how they deal with turmoil in a relationship and marriage breakdown.
Sheikh, what about yourself? Do you come across such instances of where brothers, whether in the context of the LMA or elsewhere, where brothers are the ones that are feeling that, you know what, like, I just can't be heard, like I feel trapped in this community, will not give my side of the story any justice because, you know, I'm assumed to be the one in the wrong because there was a marital breakdown and something was said, and it's like, you know, my side doesn't even count. Like, do you encounter cases of that?
Yeah, I think it actually works both ways. You know, sometimes, you know, it's the sisters that feel that they're not heard by the brothers, and, you know, the sheikhs are, you know, just, you know, sort of, like basically condoning, or, you know, so I think, you know, part of it is because there's not much open conversation, you know, like perhaps justified because, you know, like, you know, don't speak, I mean, yes, you know, you avoid ikhtilat, you avoid, you know, mingling, you avoid casual conversations as much as possible, but like, you know, it's got to a point where there's no communication. We don't understand sisters' perspectives, you know, as men, and then like men in turn are not understanding, and women aren't understanding men's perspectives either, you know, so, and then the exchange is just on forums, and like, you know, the grievance or the perceptions, you know, aren't fully conveyed in that medium, you know, so, there is a gap in the conversation, there's a gap in, you know, fully conveying each other's perspective, and that's sort of, you know, unfortunately leading to this rift between men and women in society, unfortunately. So yeah, like in terms of, you know, cases, I mean, sometimes there have been brothers who felt like, you know, especially if they're from overseas, I mean, this is sort of on a tangent, but like sometimes, you know, the brother, he's a cousin of his wife, and she, you know, got married to him over there, and then, you know, like she has a certain worldview in terms of like how to raise, you know, the child, you know, having a routine in place, but then, you know, he's got a very different perspective on, you know, just, you know, roles and responsibilities, you know, based on his experience, and he doesn't feel heard, and he feels like, you know, because he's the only one in the country, he doesn't have like relatives, you know, to support him. He doesn't feel like there's many people to back him up or to you know, try to resolve the conflict within the marriage, you know, so that there's often, you know, those cultural issues on roles and responsibilities, and you know, so it's not so much that, you know, it's because he's a guy that he's not heard, it's sometimes, you know, for other reasons, you know, sometimes it's just, you know, miscommunication and that sort of thing.
Here's an interesting question that someone has raised, sister, on our stream. She says, question for the panelists. What if a man is married to a narcissist woman, right? She may not be physically violent, but she is abusive in her treatment of him, controls him through blackmail and threats, and doesn't uphold his honor in front of others, and talks badly about and insults him. How would a Muslim man deal with this type of abuse?
Yeah, it's quite easy. I mean, you can just divorce. You know, it's much easier for a man compared to a woman. But obviously, like when there's children involved, you know, that's something else to factor in. You know, like leaving, of course, is much harder for a woman, but you know, for a man, you know, it's possible to some extent, but. You know, I guess, you know, you would want someone like that under the same roof, you know, like whatsoever. And to be honest, you know, like, you know, so far we've just been talking in the context of marriage, but, you know, as a matter of fact, it happens, you know, I've you know, responded to inquiries where, you know, a girl or a daughter was complaining about her mum, you know, basically exhibiting those tendencies, you know, so like this mum would be so, you know, like making dua against her, the siblings, and whenever, you know, the siblings would reconcile, making sure that, you know, like, you know, she would bring up those previous conflicts between siblings to keep them apart.
Divide and conquer.
What was really bad towards, you know, her husband, you know, so sometimes, you know, it's not just, you know, the context of marriage, you know, sometimes it's actually within a parent and child, you know, relationship, and then sometimes the din is used, you know, so this is sort of touching on, you know, spiritual abuse, you know, where, you know, because you have to obey me, and there's birrul walidain, and you have to obey your mum, like, you know, I'm going to use that to the full extent, I'm going to abuse that right, you know, to the full extent. It happens sometimes with narcissistic, or, you know, quote unquote husbands, you know, abusive husbands, you know, like abusing the din in a way that, you know, basically exceeds, you know, the scope of, you know, where it's supposed to be applied and the subject area, you know.
Well, very interesting note, because this will be the last question.
Sure.
And I think this is the real takeaway that I want for us to go away with from today's episode. So this entire issue and topic is quite fraught, right, as we've sort of discussed. And you've both seen this, but how do we get beyond the conflict beyond the labels and actually try to get to the crux of the problem, which I think we've actually gotten to, that people are facing, and the grievances that we have. Like, what is the, and it may not be easy, and it may not be easy for people to necessarily take up that way of dealing with this issue, but if it was, and you were to say, this is what we need to do, what at the core of it is it that we need to do as individuals and as a community to be able to get beyond those sorts of issues?
Okay. Should I start?
Absolutely.
So I mean, I guess there's sort of the immediate solutions and then long-term solutions. Like in terms of immediate solutions, definitely keeping victims of domestic violence safe. That's a priority. And then in terms of just changing and allowing this community to heal. I think realizing that the use of violence or abuse within relationships, it doesn't always occur necessarily because the perpetrator is bad. Sometimes it's a combination of bad and sad as well. Just to use some psychological lingo. They talk about mad, bad, and sad. So like it's not just because the person's morally corrupt. It's sometimes
they weren't born evil. They weren't born
exactly.
evil. Yeah.
There's advanced or adverse childhood experiences. That can be a big predictor of domestic violence, of abuse. I think a really important issue is to put this in the context of trauma, have a trauma-informed approach to discussing the topic of domestic violence. Not to give perpetrators a free pass, but rather just to understand, contextualize the problem, and that allows us to move forward. So if a person, especially with brothers, if they have a particular issue, like whether it's a pornography addiction, for example, if they have anger problems, recognizing the problem is one thing, but then seeking treatment for those problems is really important. And I think this is something that needs to be pushed by imams, by especially in khutbahs and that sort of thing. Whenever a problem occurs in a marriage, or like the wife is upset, it's not that the burden of change shouldn't always be on the wife, where you just need to make yourself be nicer to your husband, just to make him like you. No, if he's got an issue, like tell the guy to pull himself together, to fight his own demons, and that's the sort of discourse and conversation and awareness that should be pushed, inshallah.
Sheikh Mohammed, what do you think?
So I think I'll start by saying that so I mentioned before that I don't think it's about religion. I think it's more about socioeconomic status. I think it's more significant. It's not necessarily this is the only thing, but also I would say that it's also not about gender. I mean, both genders are equally capable of being a perpetrator. I think if we look at it in detail, it's more to do with power dynamics. And either side could try to take power, and either side could identify themselves as the person who should be in power. And look, with any relationship, with any social circle, like there's a hierarchy, whether it's explicitly defined or it's something that's implied. There's a hierarchy. Like humans are a species where we look to structure and to organize, and we have hierarchy. And so within the relationship, there's someone who takes a dominant role, and they take the reins, and they try to lead the relationship into successful, positive light. And as Sheikh Jamal was mentioned before, it's like talk about qawama, like that's usually placed in the hands of the man. And so, but you do have if someone is trying to if someone who they've identified themselves as taking the reins, whether man or woman, there's a susceptibility, and you have to be aware of it. Like you have to be aware of your own susceptibility to abusing your power, because it's abuse of power, really. And that's not to say that the person who isn't holding the reins can't be abusive, because you could try to usurp power, really. And like one thing that I learned from one of my former psychologist colleagues, I love to share, is that look, when you're passive, so let's talk about passive, assertive, and aggressive. Like when you're passive, you don't get what you want. When you're aggressive, right, like you might get what you want, but at the expense of the other person. When you're assertive, like the ideal is to be assertive, so you're not quiet in relation to your rights. You speak up, but the assertive approach is usually the one that gets a good outcome for everyone involved. And so I think we need to be able to have a proper analysis of it, rather than just say domestic violence, this is abuse. Let's break them up, and prevent this from ever happening again. Let's try to understand it, and let's look at these power dynamics and help people to understand how they can live within these relationships, like as we were saying before.
One of the sheikhs that I was referring to before, he's actually asked a question on the feed.
He has.
Sheikh Mohammed Assalamu alaikum. From Melbourne. So let's he's made a comment, and I think it'd be timely. We have enough time to be able to address it. He says, I wonder if the panelists know, in the course of fact-finding missions to substantiate claims of violence made by women against men, whether the families of these women frequently know about the violence that these women are claiming is taking place and can confirm if it happened. I ask this because in the case of Islamic procedural law, so in the fiqh, when a claim like this is made, evidence must be gathered to substantiate the claim, and family is usually asked. Are women sharing these incidents with their broader families? Panelists can write their answers here later if the session is ended. It hasn't, so to the extent
they do, and sometimes it would be confirmed by the husband, who is the plaintiff or the person that's the claim is made against,
Right.
So like he'll say, well, yeah, because of this, so it'll happen like that, So that's the thing that happens. But I think one thing to point out, yes, like we talk about power dynamics and we talk about spiritual abuse, and I think what's particularly obnoxious and what really triggers me is the way some husbands, unfortunately, I mean, it doesn't always happen, but it's basically exploiting and using a sister's observance and commitment of the deen against her, and it happens with the Islamic law, so on one level it could be in terms of the way her obedience to her husband is used, like using it in a very excessive way or in a way that's not required, Islamically, there's a certain scope of ta'ah of a husband, so using that against her in a way that's not consistent with the Sharia. Another level is basically her observance of their iddah. So if a divorce has happened, there's the issue of a husband intending to take her back. Of course, this is talking about the context of a talaq al-raj'i, so like when a irrevocable talaq has been pronounced,
the three talaqs,
so if it's one of the first two, then the husband doesn't have an intention of reconciling, but like he's just giving her that sense of approaching closure, but then he takes her back just to prolong the iddah, so that's another, you could describe that as spiritual abuse, and at the same time, it's actually something that is condemned and acknowledged in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تُمْسِكُهُنَّ ضِرَارًا لِتَعْتَدُوا وَمَنْ يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ فَقَدْ ظَلَمَ نَفْسَهُ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that, yes, of course, the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is perfect, and and then also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَظْلِمُ النَّاسَ شَيْئًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not oppress people. وَلَكِنَّ النَّاسَ أَنفُسَهُم يَظْلِمُونَ. That people oppress themselves and among one another, so in this particular, this is one example of what you could describe as spiritual abuse, which is affirmed by the Quran and condemned by the Quran, because Allah says, وَمَنْ يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ فَقَدْ ظَلَمَ نَفْسَهُ وَلَا تَتَّخِذُوا آيَاتِ اللَّهِ هُزُوًا. Do not treat the ayat and the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with mockery and make light of it, in jest, yes, exactly, so there is a letter of the law, but then often the spirit of the law is abused. So that's a second example of what you would describe as spiritual abuse. The third is basically abusing the wife's commitment to there being a marital contract and using that basically as a leash. So basically sometimes separation has been prolonged for more than 6 months, and he's just not willing to pronounce the talaq, and she becomes basically a mu'allaqa. A mu'allaqa is a woman that's basically in this limbo state. She's not married nor she's divorced, and she can't move on. So she won't move on sort of through an Australian divorce, because she knows basically that she's still Islamically a wife, so that's another example of using the deen against women, because he knows, or that the husband in this particular case would knows that she's committed to the deen and wants to follow it in the way things are done, so that's, I guess, a very particularly obnoxious form of abuse, and that's what leads women, unfortunately, to feeling like Islam is a man's religion, and potentially contributing to feminism. That's really so we need to understand to what extent are these sort of shifts towards liberal ideology occurring because of the way men abuse the deen to their own advantage. So that's an important thing to think about.
Sheikh Mohammed, what would you say about that?
So look, I don't know to what extent that continues to take place, and like I said, it's not my full-time role to deal with marital disputes and issues along those lines. We do try to keep people, get as many other people involved as possible, and even with regards when I'm talking about like the examples that I've mentioned throughout our discussion this evening, I've only given you one side of each of these stories, and that's and I want to highlight that like this is just one side, and we have to. When we're dealing with marital disputes, relationship issues, we try to get multiple people involved, and sometimes there's a real reluctance. And there's people who say like, and you know, there might be some women who say we've already been through all of this. Why do I have to relive you know this whole scenario, this whole situation? But again, it comes down to us being able to say with confidence. What your situation is, what your matter is before Allah Azza wa Jal. Because I think what people really need to understand is that I'm not the one who divorces you. Like I just tell you whether you meet the conditions. That's pretty much what it is. Even in relation to marriage, it's not a condition that an imam marries the couple. The imam is just there to make sure that they meet all the conditions. And that's I think that's it's vitally important. And anyone who I think there is a problem with people who may sometimes go to an underqualified imam, and then who might just take one side of the story and act based on give a ruling or a commitment based on one side of the story. Like that gentleman who had the 7 children, and his story, there was a particular imam who he just did not involve him in the discussion at all, and he just gave her a free pass to end the relationship and go do what she wanted. The man feels like he was extremely severely wronged by this imam. He wasn't involved. He wasn't included. And so we try best we can to get the relevant parties involved. We ask for the parties, if they feel they were extremely wrong, to be a little bit patient with us, because we want to make sure everything is done right.
Yeah, absolutely fair. Inshallah khair, I think some very, very deep and powerful discussions. So I thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
I think at the core of it, after sort of what Sheikh Jamal said at the end is that safety is paramount for the victims who are immediately suffering, whichever side they're on. But if they happen to be people who are in positions of disempowerment, and it's usually women in that case, and it's obviously very, very important that physical and immediate safety be a priority. Yeah. But beyond that, as a community, obviously, there's a lot of work that we need to do, from attitudes to language to many of the things we've discussed. And I think ultimately we can all agree, regardless of where you stand about the use of language and all that sort of stuff, that the core of it is, let's just adhere to our deen on every side of this discussion, on every side of the gender divide, on every side of where you stand ideologically, that the closer you are to your Islam, the less of these issues we are going to have. And I think that's the one universal that I don't think any Muslim can possibly disagree with.
No. Excellent summation.
Yeah. And you'd have to really have a problem with Islam and its fiqh to hold otherwise. So we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to obviously enable us as a community to get closer to our deen and in understanding it, and in living in accordance with what He has decreed on all these matters. My dear Sheikhs, Jazakumullah khair for your presence today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for enlightening us with your experience and with your thoughts. It's been a really, really good discussion. And thank you, brothers and sisters, for your presence. To the brothers and sisters that have commented on the feed today, thank you so much for your contribution. It's been great to be able to inject some of those comments into the live conversation. Now, very important before I let you all go, that this coming Monday, so Monday the 26th, we have the second episode in the series, which will be coming to you from a special location for the first time, a different sort of studio set that we're using for that particular episode. We'll be bringing together a sisters panel to discuss the issue of domestic violence, and again in a similar sort of way, how do we get towards resolution of this issue as a community? What does that look like? How can we chart a better course forward to empower everyone in our community, but especially sisters in that instance, but everyone really, on the basis of our deen, and to seek rights, to fulfill our obligations, and to power ahead beyond the problems that we face in this particular sphere. I hope you can join us then. And once again, a reminder that if you're able to, then please do contribute financially to NZF's current campaign to help victims of domestic violence, help victims, whether they're men, women, children, relatives of those who are impacted by this vice. And we ask Allah to allow us to discharge our obligations as a community and to help those who are going through this particular hardship. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك ونشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت استغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.